excited about this topic. I think if people had better understanding of what boundaries are and what boundaries are not, and where they need to place boundaries and where they maybe don't need to place boundaries, the world would go better. So I'm hoping that these next sessions will be very helpful for you in terms of creating the kind of environment that you're hoping to create. Before I get into boundaries, I want to talk a little bit about passive, aggressive, and assertive, because I think that that's a precursor to understanding how to set boundaries. So, almost nobody, I would say nobody, is born assertive. Assertiveness is learned. I would say passive, assertive, and aggressive are on a continuum. And with your babies, if they're born and they're passive. They're passive when they just fall asleep in your arms and they don't fight it. They're passive when they don't throw a fit when they can't, have their candy or whatever. They're just some kids that are so chill. And we love those kinds of babies because they're just a lot easier. And then there's other kids who are born more aggressive. And those are the ones that have opinions really young, and they want what they want when they want it, and they cry really loud, and they're, usually relatively strong-willed. And that's how we're born. And then culture can shift some of that. I became more aggressive as a young person because I was in New York, and New Yorkers tend to be pretty aggressive. I think I was probably prone towards that anyway, but my mother says I was very compliant, so it makes me wonder if my culture moved me in that direction. And then I moved to California from New York, and Californians tend to be much more chill, and I think that helped me kind of settle that down. But ultimately, I had to learn what assertive is, and I think everybody has to learn that and settle there. So I'm going to define them for you. Passive is not asking for what you need or want. It's just not asking. It's just saying, oh, well, didn't happen, no big deal. Aggressive is getting what you want or need at somebody else's expense. You don't care who you step on, you just need what you need, you want what you want. And, bullies would be the easiest way to define somebody who's ultimately aggressive. And then there's assertive. Assertive is asking for what you want or need, but not at somebody else's expense. So there's a boundary there. That sense of, I know what I need or want. I'm going to go ahead and ask if I can, or if it's, if that's within the realm of possibility, but I'm not going to be a bully, but I'm not going to be passive. I am going to ask. The reason these are so important is because when you evaluate your own tendency, whichever direction you kind of were born and maybe stayed there, it will change the way that you are able to set boundaries. So if you're naturally kind of passive, you're going to struggle with boundaries because you don't like the idea, because it makes you uncomfortable to set a boundary. If you're on the aggressive side of the continuum, you're going to probably try to set too many boundaries because you're going to try to use them to control other people. And then if you have learned to be assertive, then you will have that balance. You will know how to ask for what you need or want, but you're not going to necessarily punish somebody else if you don't get it. I want you to evaluate yourself in that, and it's not a test. It's not something I have to give you questions about. I think you'll just know. And I think you'll know if you've kind of learned to be more on the assertive side. And you learn that in high school and college and in job situations. And situations where you just got stepped on, or you stepped on someone and you decide, oh, that wasn't comfortable, so I want to find that middle ground. So that's where I wanted to start. And then now what I want to do is I want to define, I have 5 or 6 statements. In this seminar, I'm going to go a lot of places. I'm going to talk about boundaries physically and mentally and emotionally and materially. I'm going to talk about, I created a personal bill of rights, things that you need to know that are safe things that that are always true, even though sometimes people try to convince you they're not. I've got principles of boundaries. So there's just a lot to this topic. I've taught on it before. I think it will really be helpful. I think you'll have a lot of aha moments in it, and I'm hoping that that's really good for all of you. So I'm gonna start with boundaries, and if Trisha hears something that's interesting to her, we're gonna have a little bit of a discussion about it, just so you know.
Pretend it's a podcast.
Yeah.
And I have some examples and stories ready to share too.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, the definition, and this is coming from, like, I looked it up on my phone, so this is whatever definition from Webster or whatever. Boundaries are personal, sometimes invisible limits that define acceptable behaviors and protect a person's well-being in relationships. The words I like about that is sometimes they're invisible. Now, Trisha was talking to me earlier about how important it is to, when we establish boundaries, to communicate those, especially to like family that we live with or in a work environment or whatever like that. So I don't want them to necessarily be invisible, but sometimes they are, and so I appreciate that in that particular definition. Another one that I want to say is that boundaries are personal lines that protect you from manipulation. And if you're good at knowing how far you're willing to go in any kind of a situation, that will help you not be manipulated. And I can give you an example just really quick. When I was in my 20s, my brother, who is a sociopathic narcissist, I think you guys know that now, asked me, well, he didn't ask, he demanded that I go to a bookstore, a used bookstore, and buy back some books that he had sold because he moved to the other side of the country. I was in California, he moved to North Carolina. And I really didn't want to. They were kind of religious in content, and I didn't agree with what most of the books said, and I just felt really paralyzed in the situation because I wanted to help him, and I knew he couldn't go do it himself, but I also felt uncomfortable with it. So I avoided it for a little while, which is kind of a typical passive thing to do. And he just kept hounding on me, and he would call me all the time and tell me, and I, guilt me into it and all this stuff. So I finally did go to that bookstore. Only one of the books was available, so I bought that one back. I knew he would never pay me back. I was 20 years old, I was in college, I was poor, but these were his demands because he's a manipulator and a conniver, and I've always felt like I shouldn't have done that. And I wished that I had the ability to set the boundary at the time and just say, I'm uncomfortable with that. No, I'm not going to go do that. But sometimes, because we're torn within ourselves, we do something we don't want to do that we don't have to do. So I am going to talk a little bit later about the concept of duty and obligation, because I do think that that's a really important topic in the conversation of boundaries. But in my opinion, that was not duty or obligation. It was just manipulation. So, okay. I want you to know that number 3, boundaries are a blessing when they're driven by love. And I think that's another aspect of the consideration of duty and obligation. We don't want to set boundaries to be mean. We're trying to set boundaries to make life more comfortable for everyone. And I'll give you a little silly example. My 5-year-old grandson wanted to spend time with me, and I had gotten there and I babysit his 2-year-old brother when he goes to his class. And so he wanted to have an hour that was just his, and I said, Cal, I'm not going to do that because that's mean. I'm not going to leave your little brother out just because you want to spend time. I said, I will focus on you, but I'm going to let him come. And at first he was mad about that, and then he was like, oh, okay. That was just setting a little tiny boundary on saying, I'm not mean, and so I'm not going to leave him out in this scenario. I babysit him alone so you can go to your class. So I'm already doing you a favor in that. What I'm doing is mom a favor because the 2-year-old wants to run all over the place, as you all know. But I just felt like I just needed him to know, no, I'm not gonna be mean to your little brother just because you want time alone or you think that that's more fair. So that's kind of an example of setting a boundary in love. And we had a great time. I mean, it was, 45-minute walk. We went to the store and bought him a treat. It was very simple.
Well, then there's a lot of times where boundaries aren't set in love. And then the other person that you're setting the boundary to, they don't have to accept that boundary. They can set their own boundary as a result of the boundary. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah, that's true.
I was in a conflict with a family member, and that family member essentially, I felt, was placing boundaries on my personality. I mean, I couldn't talk anything about, I couldn't bring up politics at all, what was happening in the world. I couldn't bring up anything about alternative medicine, which is my career. I couldn't really talk about social media or post their kids on. And so I finally said, you have boundaried my personality. And so therefore, if those are your parameters, we will not see each other. That's my boundary. Because I can't show up to an event and not be me. That's really unfair. So I need you to take that back and decide if you really want to boundary me in that way.
That's really interesting. That's really good. That's really good processing of that. So number 4, boundaries are essential because they allow you and others to feel secure, respected, safe, and comfortable. That's why you set a boundary. So number 5 goes with that. Boundaries are not about controlling others, but they help you control yourself and your own responses and what you really actually have control over, which is your life and your stuff. You don't have control over somebody else. So that's really interesting because that's kind of what she was just talking about, is this idea
They
that
boundaried me to control me.
And that's not.
And I said, no.
That's not a boundary. That's a manipulation. So those 5 things, and kind of 4.5, because boundaries are essential to allow you to feel secure, respected, safe, and comfortable, but boundaries are not for the purpose of controlling other people. So, just to kind of recap, I'm going to get into the next thing that I'm going to talk about are the all those things that I was talking about earlier, like personality, physical, emotional, relational, financial, material. And I'll probably do 3 of those at the next section and 3 of those at the next session. And then I have 10 principles that I want to talk about with regard to boundaries. And what I really want you to do is I want you to start taking notes in a framework so you can think about relationships that might be difficult, like, my brother being as difficult as he's always been in my life. I actually have to thank him because I probably understand boundaries better than I would have had I not had a sociopathic narcissist in my life. He, when my mother when we had my mother's funeral, he spoke at the funeral. And my daughter-in-law, who's a therapist, I said, because she'd never met him before, I didn't have him come to the wedding, and which made him really mad. Actually, my son set that boundary. He said, I want you to be happy in my wedding, so I'm going to have you not invite your brother. I'm like, thank you. That's so sweet. But she said to me after the funeral, I said, so what did you think of my brother? And she said, well, he was an actually really interesting case study. I was like, yeah, that's really true. He fits. There's 25 aspects of
30.
narcissism.
30, yeah.
Well, the thing I looked up had 25, and he had 23 of the 25. So he really fits it really well.
Yeah.
So do you have any other comments before
Well,
we
there
quit
just
for this
was
session?
there's another example of boundaries of, I had a friend come to me and she said, I've set boundaries with somebody in my family, and that's that. And I said, okay, so how did it go when you communicated those boundaries to your family member? And she said, well, I didn't. And I think that that's a problem with boundaries too, because at some point you have to say it, which is that assertiveness.
Right. Yeah.
If you are just passive, it does remain an invisible boundary, and it becomes really confusing, and you'll probably lose the relationship with that person. So you need to know, if you're going to set an invisible boundary, then you're probably going to lose that relationship.
Yeah.
But you can't be aggressive about it either, and you can't control them. And so one of the things that she didn't like about this particular relationship is that they drink a lot. And so she didn't want to hang out over there at their house because they were drinking. But then she didn't want to say that either because she didn't want to control them. Right? So what's your response to how do you coordinate that from a boundary perspective?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question yet because I don't think we have enough information. But I do want to say that that's what makes boundaries complicated, is that you have more than one dynamic going on. And that's why I really think when you do set a boundary, you have to pray about it. I think you have to talk through it with your spouse or somebody important to you. I think you have to really decide. And I'll give you another example. I know somebody who, children are supposed to be in car seats. Absolutely, they are. Grandparents are sometimes a little bit lazy about that. And this woman, and there were probably other dynamics going on too, so I don't know exactly, but I do know that her response, I think, was really extreme, and she was trying to set a boundary, but I think in doing so she really sabotaged her relationship. So her mother took her daughter somewhere and didn't have a car seat. Now the daughter's 5, so she did strap her into the back seat, but she didn't have a car seat, and she took her to, let's say, the library. I mean, it wasn't a long drive, it was maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And when the mother found out about that, she threw such a fit. She says, I'm not going to ever let you see my daughter again.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that's kind of strong.
You could have boundaried, you can't drive her without a car seat.
Yeah.
That would have been the boundary.
And the really interesting thing, I have to tell you, is really, really sweet. I took Cal somewhere, he's 5 and he's pretty big, without a car seat somewhere. And the next time I picked him up, because I pick him up at preschool every week, he said, Nana, I need a car seat because if a policeman sees us, the policeman might arrest me. Now, that's not what his mother told him, but she did say something about the fact that it was illegal for him to not be in a car seat.
Which actually isn't true.
Oh, well, anyway, that's what she thinks.
In Colorado.
But the point is that instead of confronting me, she gave Cal permission to tell me that she wants him in a car seat. She didn't make, a federal case about it. She didn't scold me. I mean, I actually really appreciate how she handled that.
Right, that's an okay way to set a boundary.
Smart.
Yeah.
So I said to my husband, where's our little booster thing? Because I couldn't find it. That's why I didn't have him in a car seat, because he's really too big for the car seat that we own. And he said, well, I don't know. And we went hunting and we finally found it. And the next time I picked him up, I had the booster. And I said, Cal, look, I found my booster. And he just was so relieved because he really didn't want to be arrested. So that's just another, and I was thinking in that scenario how I had done the same cardinal sin that this other woman's mother had done. And she made a federal case about it and Carrie didn't. And I really appreciated that. So anyway, those are some of the dynamics that I want you to ponder as we go through this. The thing I do want to say about duty and obligation, and then we'll quit for today. There are times when you don't want to do something, you would rather set a boundary around it, but you really need to do it. And I'll give you an example. We used to go visit Ron's grandma at her nursing home. We would take all the children because partly we thought it was good for them, but also partly we were headed to another part of town where we had really good friends and we were going to go have dinner with the really good friends. And so it just made sense to stop, visit G Mama and then move on. The kids really didn't like it at all. The place didn't smell great. She was not any fun to talk to. They just had to sit there. We only stayed maybe half an hour, but
it felt like 3.
Yeah, I feel like that was an obligation.
A duty.
Not both, kind of both.
But part of your value system.
Yes.
You didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
It is an obligation. Yeah. But to set a boundary around it would feel against your values.
Yes, exactly. And so we didn't do it. I bet we did it only a handful of times. And then she got so sick and then she died. So, it wasn't something we did 50 times. We probably did it, not even probably 10 times. But my kids remember doing it. They didn't like it. They remember not liking it. They've complained about it in a sweet sort of a way as adults, like I hated doing that. But we did it anyway, and I wasn't going to let them off the hook on that. So those are the kinds of things that I think you have to evaluate what your values are, and sometimes your value in that situation trumps setting a boundary in it. So that's why this is a complicated conversation.
We're gonna have a great 12 weeks though.
Yeah, I think so. I think all of it you'll move forward quite a bit in your ability to decide where you put these parameters and maybe where you don't.
But for now, you need to take time to list everybody who's really close to you, that's in your weekly circle that you interact with, and just kind of note, do they lean aggressive or do they lean passive? And we will address more on how to correspond with people like that as we go. So your kids and your spouse and your parents and maybe your best friend, anybody that you interact with, just kind of, do they lean more passive or do they lean more aggressive? And actually jot that down and make a note of it.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay,
All
we'll see you
right.
next time.
See ya on Monday.